You know that feeling when someone takes something that belongs to you, that pit in your stomach when you realize someone's been helping themselves to your property without permission. Now, imagine coming home after a long day at work to find your expensive electric car charger that you paid for, that you installed, unplugged from your car and plugged into someone else's. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly for weeks. And when you finally confront them, they look you straight in the eye and tell you it's community power that everyone should share. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That's exactly what happened to me in Oakridge Heights, a neighborhood I once thought was filled with respectful, considerate people. I couldn't have been more wrong. Let me take you back to where it all began. 6 months ago, I made the decision to go green and purchased a Tesla Model Y. It wasn't cheap, but I'd been saving for years, and with gas prices soaring, it seemed like the perfect time to make the switch. The car was amazing, quiet, efficient, and surprisingly powerful, but there was one issue: charging. My townhouse complex has a small parking area, and while there were plans to install community chargers, eventually, I needed a solution right away. After getting permission from the HOA board, I invested nearly $2,000 to have a level 2 charger professionally installed near my designated parking spot. The installation wasn't simple. They had to run conduit, upgrade the electrical panel, and ensure everything met code requirements. But finally, I had a reliable way to charge my car at home. The charger was clearly on my property, connected to my electric meter with a sign that read "Private Charger, Unit 14" in bold letters. You'd think that would be enough to make it clear this wasn't public property, right? For the first few months, everything was fine. I'd come home from work, plug in my Tesla, and by morning it would be fully charged and ready to go. But then the Parkers moved into Unit 22 across the lot. Diana and Greg Parker seemed nice enough at first. They drove a brand new Audi e-tron and mentioned in passing how convenient it was that our complex was EV-friendly. I assumed they were referring to the planned community chargers that were supposedly coming any day now, according to our always optimistic HOA president. It started innocently enough. One evening, I came home later than usual after having dinner with friends. As I pulled into the lot, I noticed something odd. Greg was unplugging a charging cable from his Audi. My charging cable from my personal charger. I rolled down my window. "Excuse me, are you using my charger?" Greg looked up, not a hint of embarrassment on his face. "Oh, hey, yeah, hope you don't mind. We were running low and you weren't home, so..." He shrugged as if borrowing an expensive electrical installation was the same as borrowing a cup of sugar. "Actually, I do mind," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "That charger is connected to my electric meter. I pay for that electricity." "Oh." Greg's smile faltered slightly. "I didn't realize. We'll throw you a few bucks for the juice. No big deal, right? We're all in this green energy thing together." Before I could respond, he'd already walked away, leaving me sitting in my car, stunned by the audacity. I decided to let it go. Just this once. Maybe he genuinely didn't understand, but it wasn't just once. 3 days later, I came home to find Diana's Audi plugged into my charger. This time, my Tesla's charge had dropped to 40%, meaning they had unplugged my car to charge theirs. I knocked on their door, determined to clear things up once and for all. Diana answered, her perfectly highlighted hair framing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hi, Diana. I noticed your car is plugged into my charger again, and someone unplugged my Tesla to do it." Her smile didn't waver. "Oh, we figured you wouldn't mind. Your car was already partially charged, and we had an emergency meeting to get to." "But it's my private charger," I explained, feeling my patience thinning. "It's connected to my electricity bill. I specifically had it installed for my use." Diana's expression changed, her smile morphing into something more condescending. "Look, Marcus, we're all neighbors here. It's not like electricity is some limited resource. It flows to all our homes. Think of it as community power. We should all help each other out, don't you think? Community power, I repeated, unable to believe what I was hearing. That's not how electricity billing works. I pay for what comes through my meter. She waved her hand dismissively. We're all paying for electricity anyway. What's the difference if some of it goes to my car or yours? Don't be so territorial about it. I stood there, completely floored by her logic. It was like arguing with someone who insisted the sky was green. There was no reasoning with this level of entitlement. Please don't use my charger again without asking, I said firmly, and definitely don't unplug my car. That charger is my private property. Whatever, Diana replied with an eye roll. We're trying to get to a climate action meeting. Isn't sharing resources what fighting climate change is all about? She closed the door before I could respond, leaving me fuming on their doorstep. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that they respected my polite but firm request. But the Parkers were just getting started, and over the next few weeks, their sense of entitlement would grow from annoying to absolutely infuriating. They weren't just using my electricity without permission. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson about what happens when you mistake someone's patience for weakness. Little did they know, I was about to document everything and fight back in ways they never anticipated. This wasn't just about a charging cable anymore. It was about standing up to people who believed the rules simply didn't apply to them. And trust me, what happened next made those community power claims look even more ridiculous than they already were. I hoped my conversation with Diana would put an end to the problem, but I quickly realized I was dealing with people who had a completely warped sense of entitlement. Over the next 2 weeks, I found their Audi connected to my charger, no less than 5 more times. Each incident seemed more brazen than the last. The third time it happened, I was running late for an important client meeting. I'd planned to leave with a full charge, but when I got to my car, the battery was at 30%, barely enough to make it to my meeting and back. My charger was once again plugged into the Parker's Audi. I sent Greg a text message. Found my charger connected to your car again. I need it back immediately. I'm late for a meeting and my car isn't charged. 20 minutes passed before he responded. Chill out. We'll be done in an hour. An hour. I couldn't believe it. I had to reschedule my meeting, damaging my professional reputation because Greg couldn't be bothered to respect my property. When I confronted him later that day, his response was even more infuriating. Look, man, it's not like you own the electricity, he said with an irritating smirk. It's all coming from the same power grid anyway. That's not how this works, I explained, struggling to maintain my composure. I pay for what comes through my meter. Every kilowatt hour you use is added to my electric bill, not yours. Greg shrugged. So what's it cost, like 50 cents, $1? Is it really worth getting so worked up about? I pulled out my phone and opened my electric bill app. Actually, each charging session for your Audi costs around 8 to 10 based on our local electricity rates. You've used it at least 5 times that I know of, so you owe me about $50 already. His eyebrows shot up momentarily before his face settled back into that smug expression. Fine, whatever. I'll Venmo you when I get a chance. Needless to say, that Venmo payment never came. The 4th incident happened on a rainy Sunday evening. I'd just returned from visiting my parents and found Diana in the act of unplugging my car. She didn't even try to hide what she was doing. Oh, Marcus, she said casually, as if we were meeting at a coffee shop rather than her being caught stealing my electricity. We're heading to Brentwood for dinner and needed a quick charge. You don't mind, right? Actually, I do mind, I replied, my patience wearing impossibly thin. I've asked you repeatedly not to use my charger without permission. Diana rolled her eyes. It's just electricity. Why are you being so selfish about it? In Europe, people share resources all the time. That's why they're so much more advanced in fighting climate change. I'd lived in Amsterdam for 2 years and knew for a fact this wasn't true. but arguing with Diana's made-up facts seemed pointless. "This is the last time," I warned. "If I find you using my charger again without permission, I'll report it to the HOA and file a police report for theft of services." Diana's expression hardened. "Police report? Are you serious? Over a little electricity? God, you're exactly what's wrong with this country. So obsessed with your private property that you can't even share clean energy with your neighbors." She stomped off to her Audi, yanking my charging cable from her port with unnecessary force and tossing it onto the ground before driving away. I picked up my cable, checking for damage, and noticed Greg watching from their townhouse window. Rather than looking embarrassed by his wife's behavior, he was smirking. That's when I realized this wasn't just about convenience for them. They enjoyed taking what wasn't theirs. They got satisfaction from ignoring boundaries. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The fifth time pushed me to my breaking point. I returned from the grocery store to find Greg chatting with another neighbor while his Audi charged using my equipment. When he saw me, rather than appearing embarrassed, he waved as if everything was normal. "Hey, Marcus, just borrowing a bit of juice. Hope that's cool." Before I could respond, he turned to our neighbor Michael and said, "Marcus has been super generous letting us use his charger while we wait for the community ones to be installed." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was taking credit for my generosity when I had explicitly told them multiple times not to use my charger. "Actually, Greg, I've repeatedly asked you not to use my charger without permission," I corrected. Him struggling to keep my voice even, Greg laughed it off. "Oh, come on, don't be so uptight. It's just a little community power sharing." Michael looked uncomfortable, obviously sensing the tension. "I didn't realize. I thought you guys had an arrangement." "We don't," I stated firmly. "They've been using it without permission and refusing to pay for the electricity they use." Greg's friendly facade faltered for a moment, replaced by something harder, colder. "Jesus, Marcus, you're making a big deal out of nothing. If 50 cents of electricity is going to break the bank for you, maybe you shouldn't have bought a Tesla." Michael excused himself quickly, not wanting to be caught in our conflict. Once he was gone, Greg's demeanor changed completely. "Look, this is ridiculous. It's a charging cable, not the crown jewels. The community chargers are coming soon anyway, so what's the harm?" "The harm is that you're stealing from me," I replied, "and you're damaging my property by unplugging my car mid-charge, which can hurt the battery over time." "Oh, please," Greg scoffed. "These cars are designed to handle it. Stop being such a princess about everything." He unplugged his nearly full Audi and tossed my cable onto the ground, just like Diana had done. As he walked away, he called over his shoulder, "Maybe if you weren't so selfish, you'd have more friends in the neighborhood." I stood there, seething with frustration. This wasn't just about the electricity anymore. It was about respect, boundaries, and the audacity of people who believed they were entitled to whatever they wanted, regardless of who it belonged to. That night I received a notification from my Tesla app that my car had been unplugged at 2:17 a.m. I looked out my window and, sure enough, the Parker's Audi was connected to my charger again. They had waited until the middle of the night, thinking I wouldn't notice. That was the moment I decided enough was enough. These people weren't going to stop unless I forced them to. The next day, I installed a small security camera aimed at my parking spot and charger. If they wanted to keep stealing my electricity, they were going to do it on camera. And I was going to build an irrefutable case against their community power nonsense once and for all. The security camera was just the beginning of my plan. I also purchased a smart electric meter that connected to my charger, allowing me to track exactly how much electricity was being used and when. Both devices synced to my phone, sending notifications whenever the charger was connected or disconnected. If the Parkers were going to keep stealing from me, at least now I'd have concrete evidence. It didn't take long for that evidence to start rolling in. The very next evening, while I was at a work dinner, my phone buzzed with an alert. Charger disconnected. 2 minutes later, charger connected. I opened the camera feed to see Diana unhooking my cable from my Tesla and plugging it into her Audi. She looked directly at the camera, noticed it, and hesitated for a moment before continuing anyway. The audacity was stunning. I decided not to confront her immediately. Instead, I'd let the evidence build. Over the next week, the Parkers used my charger 6 more times, always unplugging my car in the process. My electric bill for the month arrived, showing a 40% increase compared to the previous month. That was roughly $75 more than normal. Money straight from my pocket into the Parkers' gas tank, so to speak. With my growing frustration, I considered my options. I could confront them again, but previous attempts had proven useless. I could report them to the HOA, but our association was notoriously slow to act on complaints. I could install a lock on the charger, but that might create issues with the HOA since the installation had been approved under specific conditions. While I was weighing these options, the situation escalated in a way I hadn't anticipated. I returned from work one afternoon to find Greg chatting with several neighbors near my parking spot. As I approached, I realized with horror that he was giving an impromptu workshop on EV charging, using my charger as his demonstration model. So, this type of level 2 charger delivers about 32 amps, Greg was explaining to the small crowd, handling my equipment with casual familiarity. That's enough to fully charge most EVs overnight. Marcus has been generous enough to let us use it while the community chargers are being installed. I parked my car and walked toward the group, blood boiling. "Excuse me," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I've never given permission for anyone to use my charger. In fact, I've repeatedly asked Greg and Diana to stop using it without my permission." An awkward silence fell over the group. Greg's friendly expression faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "Come on, Marcus," he said with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We've been sharing resources as neighbors. That's what communities do." "We haven't been sharing anything," I corrected him firmly. "You've been taking without permission and refusing to pay for what you use. That's called theft." Several neighbors shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a woman named Rachel, who lived a few doors down, spoke up. "Greg mentioned that you two had an arrangement. He said you were fine with neighbors using it occasionally." "There is no arrangement," I stated flatly. "And I've installed security cameras that show them repeatedly using my charger without permission, often in the middle of the night." Greg's face darkened. "You're recording us? That's an invasion of privacy." "It's a security camera on my property." "Monitoring my property," I replied, "and it's captured you and Diana stealing from me repeatedly." The neighbors began to disperse, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Greg stepped closer to me, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "You're making yourself look like an ass in front of everyone," he hissed. "It's just electricity. Get over yourself." "It's my property and my money," I countered. "And you're not just using it. You're lying to our neighbors about it, making me look like the bad guy for wanting to protect what's mine." Greg's friendly mask dropped completely. "Look around, Marcus. Nobody likes the selfish neighbor who won't help others out. Keep making a scene about this, and you'll find living here very uncomfortable." Was he actually threatening me over a charger that I purchased, installed, and paid for? "Stay away from my charger," I said, keeping my voice level despite my anger. "This is your last warning." Greg smirked and walked away, rejoining Diana, who had been watching from their front step. She gave me a cold smile before they both disappeared. Inside their townhouse, that night I couldn't sleep. Greg's thinly veiled threat kept replaying in my mind. What did he mean by making things uncomfortable? Would they escalate beyond just taking my electricity? The security camera provided some peace of mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this conflict was spiraling beyond a simple dispute over a charging cable. My unease proved justified the very next morning. When I went to my car, I discovered that someone had forcibly yanked the charging cable, damaging the connector. It still worked, but the locking mechanism was broken, meaning anyone could disconnect it from my car at any time without needing to unlock it first. Repairing or replacing it would cost hundreds of dollars. The security footage showed Greg approaching my car at 1:30 a.m., clearly intoxicated, yanking the cable with excessive force when it wouldn't immediately disconnect. He seemed surprised. When something broke, examining the connector before shrugging and plugging it into his car anyway. This was no longer about community power or neighborly sharing. This was deliberate property damage. I tried being reasonable. I tried setting boundaries. I'd even tried collecting evidence quietly. But destroying my property crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. I took photos of the damaged connector, downloaded the security footage, and compiled my electric usage data. The Parkers had stolen approximately $112 worth of electricity over the past month and caused roughly $350 in damage to my charging equipment. It was time to take this evidence to the authorities. With my evidence organized, I headed to the local police station to file a report. I wasn't sure what to expect. Would they dismiss this as a trivial neighbor dispute, or would they take the property damage and theft seriously? The officer who took my report, a woman named Sergeant Rivera, listened carefully as I explained the situation. I showed her the security footage, the photos of the damaged connector, my electric bills showing the unusual spikes in usage, and the data from my smart meter that correlated perfectly with the video evidence of the Parkers using my charger. "Let me get this straight," Sergeant Rivera said, reviewing my documentation. "They've been using your charger without permission for weeks, refused to stop when asked directly multiple times, damaged your equipment, and then tried to turn your neighbors against you by claiming you had given them permission to use it." "That's correct," I confirmed. "And they've cost me over $100 in electricity and $350 in equipment damage." She nodded, her expression professional but sympathetic. "This is actually more common than you might think. As electric vehicles become more popular, we're seeing more disputes over charging access, but most stop short of property damage and certainly don't involve this level of persistence." She took detailed notes and filed an official report for theft of services and property damage. "We'll send an officer to speak with the Parkers. This kind of behavior needs to stop." I felt a wave of relief as I left the police station. Finally, someone with authority would intervene. I wouldn't have to handle this alone anymore. Later that afternoon, I was working from home when I noticed a police cruiser pull into our complex. 2 officers approached the Parkers' townhouse and knocked on their door. From my window, I could see Diana's shocked expression as she spoke with them. She gestured animatedly, occasionally pointing in the direction of my unit. After about 15 minutes, the officers left, and Diana immediately stormed across the parking lot toward my townhouse. I braced myself for the confrontation I knew was coming. My doorbell rang, and when I opened the door, Diana was standing there, face flushed with anger. "You called the police on us," she practically shouted, "over a charging cable. Are you insane?" "I called the police because you damaged my property," I replied calmly, "and because you've repeatedly stolen electricity despite being asked to stop." "Stolen. Stolen." Her voice rose higher. "It's electricity. It's not like we took your TV. God, you're so dramatic." "The police seem to disagree," I said. "They consider it theft of services, which is a real crime, and damaging my charger is vandalism." Diana's eyes narrowed. "Greg barely touched your precious charger. It was already broken." "I have video showing exactly what happened," I informed her. "The police have seen it too." This seemed to give her pause, but only momentarily. You know what your problem is, Marcus? You don't understand community. You're so wrapped up in your mine mentality that you can't see the bigger picture. We're all trying to save the planet here by stealing from your neighbors, by sharing resources, she snapped. Do you know how many fewer emissions there would be if people just shared more? But no, everyone's so obsessed with private property that they'd rather see the world burn than let someone borrow a little electricity. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was trying to frame their theft as some kind of environmental activism. If you care so much about sharing resources, I countered, why don't you offer to pay for what you use? Or ask permission first? Or respect when someone says no? Because we shouldn't have to ask permission for basic needs, Diana insisted. In a truly evolved society, resources would flow freely to where they're needed. Your hoarding mentality is what's wrong with the world. Hoarding? I'm using my own charger that I paid for. That's not hoarding. Diana shook her head with exaggerated disappointment. You just don't get it. And now you've involved the police in what should have been a simple neighborly matter. Do you have any idea how this makes us look? Like people who take things that don't belong to them, I suggested. Her expression hardened. This isn't over, Marcus, not by a long shot. The HOA is going to hear about how you're creating a hostile living environment, and good luck making any friends in this complex after everyone hears you're the kind of person who calls the cops on his neighbors. Before I could respond, Greg appeared behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Let's go, Diana, he said quietly, though his eyes were fixed on me with unconcealed hostility. We'll handle this another way. As they walked away, I heard Greg mutter, entitled Tesla drivers think they own the world. I closed my door, feeling a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, I was glad the police had taken my complaint seriously. On the other, I was now worried about what handling this another way might entail. Would the Parkers try to turn the entire complex against me? Would they escalate further? That evening, I received an email from our HOA president, Vivian Chen. Dear Mr. Reynolds, it has come to our attention that there is an ongoing dispute regarding your electric vehicle charging station. We have received a complaint alleging that you have created a hostile environment by refusing to participate in resource sharing and involving law enforcement without first seeking mediation through the HOA. Please attend our next board meeting on Thursday at 7 p.m. to discuss this matter. Regards, Vivian. Oakridge Heights HOA president. I stared at the email in disbelief. The Parkers had actually gone to the HOA and twisted the situation to make me look like the troublemaker. They had moved quickly, too, barely hours after the police visit. I immediately replied, explaining that I would attend and that I had substantial evidence of theft and property damage to present. I also mentioned that I had already filed a police report and that the officers had found my complaints legitimate. As I sent the email, I couldn't help wondering, how had a simple matter of protecting my property turned into this complex battle? And would the HOA, notorious for avoiding conflict and making arbitrary decisions, actually stand up for what was right? Thursday evening arrived and I prepared meticulously for the HOA meeting. I transferred all my evidence to a tablet, the security footage, photographs of the damaged charger, electric bills, meter readings, and a copy of the police report. I even prepared a timeline documenting every instance of the Parkers using my charger without permission, along with my attempts to resolve the situation amicably. The meeting was held in our complex's small community room. When I arrived, several board members were already seated at a folding table at the front, with Vivian Chen in the center. About a dozen residents had shown up, including the Parkers, who sat in the front row looking oddly confident. Let's begin, Vivian announced once. Everyone was settled. We have a dispute between residents regarding an electric vehicle charging station. Mrs. Parker, since you filed the complaint, would you like to speak first? Diana stood, smoothing her designer blazer. Thank you, Vivian. As many of you know, Greg and I moved here because Oakridge Heights advertises itself as an eco-friendly community. The listing specifically mentioned planned EV charging stations, which was important to us as electric vehicle owners. She paused, making eye contact with several board members. Unfortunately, those stations haven't been installed yet. When we noticed that Marcus had a private charging station, we thought this was an opportunity for community cooperation during this temporary gap in infrastructure. After all, we're all neighbors trying to make environmentally responsible choices. Diana's voice took on a wounded tone. We were shocked when Marcus not only refused to share this resource, but escalated immediately to involving the police, creating a hostile and uncomfortable living environment for us and other residents. This isn't the kind of community spirit Oakridge Heights claims to foster. I had to admire her performance. She'd completely reframed the narrative, painting herself as a disappointed environmentalist and me as an uncooperative neighbor. Thank you, Mrs. Parker, Vivian said. Mr. Reynolds, your response. I stood, tablet in hand. Thank you for the opportunity to present the facts. First, I want to clarify that the charging station in question was installed at my expense. Nearly $2,000, with proper HOA approval, specifically for my personal use. It's connected to my electric meter, meaning I pay for every kilowatt-hour used through it. I turned to face the room rather than just the board. The Parkers began using my charger without permission shortly after moving in. When I discovered this, I politely asked them to stop. They refused. I asked again multiple times over several weeks. They not only continued using my charger without permission, but often unplugged my car to charge theirs. I held up my tablet. I have security footage showing them using my charger at least 14 times after being explicitly asked not to, often in the middle of the night. I also have documentation showing they've cost me over $100 in electricity. Several residents looked surprised. The Parkers shifted uncomfortably. Most seriously, I continued, I have video evidence of Mr. Parker damaging my charging equipment while trying to forcibly disconnect it. The repair cost is estimated at $350. I played a brief clip showing Greg yanking the connector and breaking the locking mechanism. Several gasps echoed through the room. I involved the police only after exhausting all reasonable attempts to resolve this directly, and only after my property was damaged. This isn't about being uncooperative. It's about protecting my property from ongoing theft and vandalism. Vivian looked troubled. Mr. Parker, do you deny damaging the charging equipment? Greg cleared his throat. I may have been a bit overzealous when disconnecting it, but it was already malfunctioning. And regarding the electricity, we're talking about pennies here, not some major theft. Actually, I interjected, pulling up my utility bills, electric vehicle charging is substantial. Each session for their Audi costs approximately $80. Over the past month, they've added more than $100 to my electric bill. The board members exchanged glances. A board member named Terrence spoke up. Mrs. Parker, you mentioned that the complex advertised planned EV charging stations. Were you told these would be available immediately upon moving in? Diana fidgeted. Well, no, but the community charging stations are on the 3-year improvement plan, Vivian clarified. They're scheduled for installation next summer, as documented in the HOA minutes we provide to all new residents. Exactly, I added, which is why I went through proper channels to install my own charger for my personal use. Another resident raised her hand. I'm confused. Did you ever ask Marcus if you could use his charger, or did you just start using it? Diana's composure faltered slightly. We assumed it would be fine. Everyone in our previous neighborhood shared resources. Did you offer to pay for the electricity you were using? The resident pressed. We would have if he'd asked nicely instead of being so territorial about it, Greg interjected defensively. I couldn't help myself. I did ask multiple times. You promised to Venmo me and never did. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with more residents asking questions and the board reviewing my evidence. The mood in the room had shifted noticeably. What the Parkers had framed as community resource sharing was clearly being seen for what it was, taking something that didn't belong to them without permission. Finally, Vivian called for order. The board will need to discuss this matter privately. However, I think it's clear that privately installed charging equipment belongs to the resident who installed it, and using it without permission is inappropriate. We'll issue our formal decision by email tomorrow. As the meeting adjourned, several neighbors approached me with sympathetic comments. The Parkers slipped out quickly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The following morning, I received the HOA's decision via email. It was more comprehensive than I expected. After reviewing evidence and testimony from all parties involved, the Oakridge Heights HOA board has reached the following conclusions. Privately installed EV charging equipment remains the exclusive property of the resident who installed it, regardless of its location within the complex. Using another resident's charging equipment without explicit permission constitutes unauthorized use of private property. Mr. and Mrs. Parker must reimburse Mr. Reynolds for all electricity used without permission, $112.47 based on provided documentation, and pay for repairs to the damaged charging equipment, $350. Until community charging stations are installed, residents with electric vehicles must make their own charging arrangements without using other residents' private equipment. To prevent further disputes, Mr. Reynolds may install a secure lock on his charging equipment, provided it doesn't permanently alter the approved installation. Any further violations will result in fines as outlined in the HOA Covenant Section 8.3 regarding misuse of private and community property. I felt vindicated. Not only had the HOA sided with me, but they had also authorized me to lock my charger and mandated that the Parkers pay for the electricity they'd stolen and the damage they'd caused. My relief was short-lived. That afternoon, I encountered Diana in the parking lot as I returned from work. Instead of avoiding me, she marched directly toward me, waving a printed copy of the HOA email. "Are you happy now?" she demanded. "You've got the whole HOA board wrapped around your finger, congratulating you for being selfish." "This isn't about being selfish," I replied, trying to keep my cool. "It's about basic respect for other people's property. It's always about property." "With people like you," she sneered, "never about the greater good or helping others. If you were so concerned about the greater good, you could have approached this completely differently," I pointed out. "You could have asked permission, offered to pay for the electricity, or arranged for your own charging solution like I did." Diana's face flushed. "We shouldn't have to ask permission to access clean energy. That's the whole point you're missing. In a truly progressive community, resources would be shared." "But we don't live in your utopian fantasy," I said, my patience wearing thin. "We live in a real community where people respect each other's boundaries and property, and no amount of self-righteous environmental rhetoric changes the fact that you took something that wasn't yours to take." She shook her head in disgust. "You have no idea how backward you sound. People like you are why this country is so behind on sustainability. I drive an electric vehicle and installed a charging station at my own expense," I reminded her. "I'm hardly anti-environment, I'm just anti-theft." Diana huffed in frustration. "Greg thinks we should contest this decision. The HOA bylaws clearly state that common area improvements should benefit everyone." "My charger isn't a common area improvement," I explained, for what felt like the 100th time. "It's a private installation that I received permission to place near my designated parking spot. The HOA approved it as my personal equipment." "We'll see about that," she threatened. "Greg is looking into our legal options. We're not paying for damages to equipment that was already faulty." I pulled out my phone. "I have video showing your husband breaking it. Would you like to see it again? Or would you prefer a judge to see it?" This seemed to give her pause, but only momentarily. "This isn't over," she declared before storming off toward her townhouse. I sighed and continued to my own unit, wondering if this conflict would ever truly end. That evening, I researched charging station locks and ordered a heavy-duty one that would arrive in 2 days. Until then, I'd have to remain vigilant. The next morning, I found a notice taped to my door. It was a legal letter from Parker and Associates, which I quickly realized was Greg's law firm. The letter claimed that my charging station constituted an unauthorized permanent modification to common property and demanded that I either remove it entirely or provide equal access to all residents with electric vehicles. I immediately contacted the HOA and forwarded them the letter. Vivian called me within the hour. "This is ridiculous," she said, sounding genuinely annoyed. "Your installation was explicitly approved by the board. We have all the documentation. Mr. Parker is misrepresenting HOA bylaws." "What should I do?" I asked. "Nothing for now," she advised. "The board will send a formal response clarifying that your installation is approved and private. If they persist with legal threats, you might want to consult your own attorney, but I honestly don't think it will come to that. They don't have a leg to stand on." True to her word, the HOA sent a firmly worded letter to the Parkers later that day, with copies of my original installation approval attached. The letter explicitly stated that any legal action against me regarding the properly approved charging station would be considered harassment and could result in HOA penalties. For the moment at least, it seemed the HOA was firmly on my side. But the Parkers' hostility had only intensified, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were planning something more than legal posturing and passive-aggressive encounters in the parking lot. The charging station lock arrived 2 days later. It was a robust device with a weather-resistant keypad that would prevent unauthorized access to my charger. I installed it immediately, feeling a sense of relief as I programmed the security code. Finally, my property would be protected. That evening, I noticed the Parkers watching from their window as I demonstrated the lock to a curious neighbor. Their expressions were unreadable, but the intensity of their gaze made me uncomfortable. Still, I tried to convince myself that the worst was behind us. With the lock installed and the HOA's clear ruling, surely they would give up and find another charging solution. I was wrong. The next morning, I discovered a flyer had been slipped under every door in the complex. Community alert, environmental. Obstructionism at Oakridge Heights. Fellow residents concerned about climate change. Did you know that one of our neighbors is actively preventing access to clean energy infrastructure in our community? A privately installed EV charging station in our common area is being restricted with locks and surveillance, denying access to other eco-conscious residents. In a time of climate crisis, we believe sustainable resources should be shared, not hoarded. Join us Saturday at 10 a.m. in the community room to discuss forming an Oakridge Environmental Action Committee to address this and other sustainability issues in our complex. Together, we can make Oakridge Heights a truly green community. Concerned environmentally conscious residents. Though the flyer didn't mention me by name, it was obvious who they were targeting. The Parkers had pivoted to a new strategy. Instead of challenging the HOA ruling directly, they were trying to mobilize other residents against me by framing the issue as environmental activism. I was furious, but also worried. What if other residents bought into this narrative? What if the Parkers managed to sway public opinion and pressure the HOA to reverse their decision? I needed to get ahead of this. I drafted a response flyer that calmly explained the situation, emphasizing that I had installed the charging station at my own expense, that it was connected to my personal electric meter, and that the Parkers had damaged my property after repeatedly using it without permission. I also noted that I was an electric vehicle owner myself, clearly supportive of green initiatives. After speaking with Vivian from the HOA, she agreed to send an official email to all residents clarifying the situation and reaffirming that private charging stations were not community property. It was a clear rebuke to the Parkers' flyer, though it maintained a neutral tone and didn't name them specifically. Saturday arrived, and despite the HOA email, about 15 residents showed up to the Parkers' meeting. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to attend as well, sitting quietly in the back of the room. Greg, dressed in a polo shirt with an environmental non-profits logo, which I suspected he had no actual affiliation with, stood at the front with a PowerPoint presentation titled "Community Resource Sharing: A Green Future." "Thank you all for coming," he began. "We're here today because we believe Oakridge Heights can be a model for sustainable living. But to do that, we need to rethink our relationship with resources and infrastructure." The presentation was slick and filled with environmental buzzwords, charts about carbon emissions, and glossy photos of smiling people sharing various resources. It was manipulative but effective. I could see several neighbors nodding along. "One example of where we're falling short," Greg continued, finally getting to his real agenda, "is our approach to EV charging. While some residents have invested in private charging infrastructure, which is commendable, restricting access to these stations undermines our collective environmental goals." A resident raised her hand. "Isn't that charging station connected to the owner's electric meter, so they pay for all the electricity used?" Greg didn't miss a beat. "Yes. And that's where our proposed solution comes in. We want to create a community fund to compensate private charging station owners for shared electricity. Everyone contributes a small amount monthly, and in return, all EV owners get access to existing charging stations." It was a clever pivot. Instead of admitting they had been stealing my electricity, they were proposing a system that would essentially force me to share my charger. Another resident spoke up. "But what about property rights? If someone pays to install something, shouldn't they have control over it?" "In normal circumstances, yes," Diana interjected smoothly. "But we're facing a climate emergency. Traditional notions of private property need to evolve when they conflict with urgent environmental needs." I couldn't stay silent any longer. I raised my hand and Greg reluctantly acknowledged me. "I appreciate the environmental concerns," I began, keeping my tone measured. "But this proposed solution seems to address a problem that doesn't exist. I installed my charger because community stations weren't available. When they are installed next summer, everyone will have access to charging. In the meantime, other residents are welcome to install their own stations, just as I did." Greg's expression hardened. "That's exactly the kind of individualistic thinking that's holding us back. Not everyone can afford to install private chargers, including you," I asked pointedly. "You drive a $75,000 Audi e-tron, but can't afford a $2,000 charging station." The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Greg's face flushed, but before he could respond, Diana jumped in. "This isn't about us personally," she said quickly. "It's about creating systems that work for everyone." The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, but the energy had shifted. While some residents seemed sympathetic to the environmental framing, others clearly saw through the Parkers' self-serving agenda. By the end, their proposed Environmental Action Committee had only gained 4 supporters, far short of the groundswell they had hoped for. As people filed out, I overheard one neighbor say to another, "They just want free electricity and are hiding behind environmentalism to get it." I couldn't have put it better myself. The failed community meeting seemed to mark a turning point. For several days, the Parkers avoided me entirely. My locked charging station remained undisturbed, and I began to hope that perhaps they had finally accepted defeat and moved on. That hope was shattered when I returned home from a weekend trip to find my charging station completely inoperable. The lockbox had been pried open with such force that the internal wiring was damaged. The charging cable itself had been cut and then poorly reattached, creating a potential safety hazard. Someone had deliberately sabotaged my property in a way that wasn't just inconvenient, but dangerous. I immediately contacted both the HOA and the police. Officer Rivera returned to take my statement and examine the damage. "This is malicious destruction of property," she said, taking photos of the mangled charging station. "And whoever did this created a serious electrical hazard. They could be charged with reckless endangerment on top of vandalism." I showed her the security footage, but the camera had been repositioned to face upward, capturing only the sky. This had clearly been deliberate. Someone had adjusted the camera before, damaging the charging station. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" Officer Rivera asked, though her tone suggested she already had a strong suspicion. "The Parkers are the only ones who have shown any interest in my charger," I replied, "and they've escalated this situation repeatedly." She nodded, making notes in her report. "We'll question them, but without direct evidence, it will be difficult to prove who did this. In the meantime, I strongly recommend you have an electrician inspect the station before using it again. This kind of tampering could create a fire hazard." After she left, I contacted my insurance company and an electrician. The news wasn't good. The damage was extensive enough that most of the charging station would need to be replaced. The estimated cost was over $1,200, and it would take at least a week to get the parts and complete the installation. In the meantime, I would have to rely on public charging stations miles from my home. The inconvenience was enormous, but what bothered me more was the malice behind the act. The Parkers hadn't just damaged my property, they'd created a potentially dangerous situation out of spite. The next day, as I was explaining the situation to a sympathetic neighbor, Greg walked by, smirking. "Having trouble with your charger?" he asked innocently. "That's a shame. Maybe now you'll appreciate the value of community infrastructure that everyone can access." The implication was clear, though he'd been careful not to admit anything directly. "The police are investigating," I said firmly. "Tampering with electrical equipment is a serious crime." He shrugged, completely unfazed. "Good luck proving anything, but you know this could have been avoided if you'd been more community-minded from the beginning." With that, he walked away, leaving me seething with frustration. He was right about one thing. Without direct evidence, it would be difficult to prove the Parkers were responsible. The security camera had been deliberately repositioned, and I had no witnesses to the vandalism. I spent the next few days in a state of anxious vigilance, worried about what the Parkers might do next. I installed additional security cameras around my townhouse, positioning them to cover multiple angles so they couldn't all be tampered with simultaneously. I also upgraded to a cloud storage system that would instantly upload any footage, ensuring I'd have evidence even if the cameras themselves were damaged. The HOA board called an emergency meeting about the incident. They unanimously voted to install security cameras in the parking areas, something they had previously resisted due to cost concerns. While this wouldn't help me immediately, it signaled that the board was taking the vandalism seriously. By the end of the week, the police had questioned the Parkers, but, as expected, had no grounds to charge them without evidence. Officer Rivera told me they had both provided alibis for the time period when the damage likely occurred, claiming they had been at a dinner party with friends. "We're keeping the case open," she assured me. "Sometimes people get overconfident and slip up, especially if they think they've gotten away with something." The electrician finally arrived to assess the damage more thoroughly, and his report confirmed my fears. Not only had the charging station been vandalized, but it had been done in a way that could have caused an electrical fire or shock hazard. Whoever did this knew enough about electrical systems to create a dangerous situation while making it look like a simple act of vandalism. This wasn't just someone breaking your equipment, the electrician explained. They deliberately cross-wired some of the connections. If you had tried to use this without inspection, it could have overheated or even electrocuted someone. This revelation chilled me to the core. The Parkers hadn't just been trying to prevent me from using my charger. They had created a potentially lethal trap. What had started as a dispute over unauthorized use of a charging cable had escalated to something far more sinister. I shared the electrician's report with Officer Rivera, who agreed that the nature of the tampering elevated the seriousness of the crime. She promised to question the Parkers again with this new information. As I waited for my charging station to be repaired, I couldn't help wondering, what would it take to end this conflict once and for all? And more importantly, how far were the Parkers willing to go in their twisted campaign against me? The repair of my charging station took longer than expected. Parts were back-ordered, and the electrician discovered additional damage during the installation. For nearly 2 weeks, I was forced to use public charging stations miles from home, adding hours to my weekly routine and considerable frustration to my life. During this time, the Parkers seemed to revel in my inconvenience. Twice, I spotted them watching me leave early for work, knowing I needed to stop at a public charger. Diana even had the audacity to suggest that my charging troubles could have been avoided if I'd embraced their community sharing proposal. The new security cameras I'd installed captured no further tampering attempts, but they did record Greg, walking past my parking spot multiple times each day, inspecting the progress of the repairs. His interest was unsettling, and I wondered what he might be planning next. My break came unexpectedly. Rachel, the neighbor who had questioned the Parkers during their community meeting, knocked on my door one evening. "I've been debating whether to tell you this," she said, looking uncomfortable. "But after hearing about how your charger was sabotaged, I can't keep quiet." She explained that on the weekend my charger was vandalized. She had been returning from a late movie and had seen Greg in the parking area around 1:30 a.m. He'd been crouched near my charging station with a tool bag beside him. I assumed he was looking for something he'd dropped, she said. He waved and said his car fob had fallen out of his pocket. I didn't think much of it until I heard about your charger the next day. This was exactly the witness I needed. Rachel agreed to provide a statement to the police, though she was clearly nervous about getting involved. "The Parkers have been unfriendly to anyone they think is on your side," she admitted. "Last week, Diana cornered me in the laundry, a room, and went on a rant about neighborhood solidarity and how people needed to pick a side in this environmental battle." I thanked Rachel for her courage and immediately called Officer Rivera. She took Rachel's statement the next morning, and by that afternoon, the police had enough evidence to question Greg more aggressively. This time, they asked him directly about being seen near my charging station at 1:30 a.m. His alibi about the dinner party fell apart when he claimed to have returned home by 11 p.m., contradicting Rachel's eyewitness account. Officer Rivera called to update me. "We've got him on. Inconsistent statements, and your neighbor's testimony puts him at the scene. We're also analyzing a pry tool we found in their garbage that matches the damage pattern on your charging station. We should have enough to make an arrest soon." 2 days later, my doorbell camera captured a moment of sweet vindication. Greg was led from his townhouse in handcuffs, charged with felony vandalism, tampering with electrical equipment, and creating a public safety hazard. Diana followed behind the officers, frantically calling someone on her phone, presumably their lawyer. The arrest made local news, with a small article titled, "Electric Vehicle Charging Dispute Leads to Felony Charges." The Oakridge Heights HOA sent out a community-wide email expressing zero tolerance for property destruction and actions that endanger residents. and announcing that the planned community charging stations would be installed ahead of schedule. That evening there was another knock at my door. It was Diana, alone and without her usual confident demeanor. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice lacking its typical self-righteousness. Against my better judgment, I agreed to listen, but remained in my doorway, recording our conversation with my phone. "Greg made a terrible mistake," she began. "He was frustrated and acted impulsively. He never meant to create a safety hazard." "The electrician said the wiring was deliberately cross-connected," I replied. "That doesn't happen by accident." Diana looked away. "He has an engineering background. Sometimes he doesn't think about the consequences of technical modifications." "What do you want, Diana?" I asked bluntly. "Your husband is facing felony charges for vandalizing my property and creating a potentially lethal hazard. Why are you here?" She took a deep breath. "We want to make this right. We'll pay for all the damages, of course, and we're willing to compensate you for the inconvenience. We just need you to tell the police you don't want to press charges." So that was it. They wanted me to help make this go away. "Your husband could have killed someone," I said quietly. "Not just me, but anyone who might have used that charger. That's not something I can simply forgive because you're offering to. And pay for the repairs." "It was a momentary lapse in judgment," Diana insisted, her voice rising. "His entire career will be ruined over a stupid charging station." "His career will be ruined because he committed a felony," I corrected her. "Actions have consequences, Diana. Maybe it's time both of you learned that." She stared at me, tears of frustration forming in her eyes. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? Getting your revenge?" "I'm not enjoying any of this," I replied honestly. "I never wanted this conflict. All I wanted was for you to respect my property and ask permission before using it. Everything that's happened since has been the result of your and Greg's choices, not mine." Diana's expression hardened. "This isn't over," she said, the threat clear in her voice despite her husband's precarious legal situation. "Actually, Diana, I think it is," I said firmly before closing the door. Greg's case moved through the legal system with surprising speed. His initial hearing was scheduled for the following week, where he would enter his plea. The district attorney contacted me to discuss the case and my role as the primary witness. Given the evidence we have, the eyewitness placing him at the scene, the tool matching the damage pattern, and the deliberately dangerous nature of the tampering, we're confident in our case, the DA explained. Mr. Parker is facing potential jail time. The severity of the situation had finally hit home. What had started as a dispute over an electric car charger had escalated to the point where someone could be imprisoned. While I believed Greg deserved consequences for his actions, especially given the dangerous nature of his sabotage, the reality of his potential incarceration was sobering. 3 days before the hearing, I received a formal letter from Greg's attorney proposing a settlement. The Parkers would pay for all damages to my charging station, including the security upgrades, reimburse me for the public charging costs I'd incurred during repairs, and pay an additional $5,000 for emotional distress. In exchange, they asked me to request leniency from the prosecutor. I consulted with the district attorney about the offer. "This doesn't impact the criminal charges directly," she explained. "The state is prosecuting Mr. Parker, not you personally. However, as the victim, your input does carry weight. If you feel the financial settlement adequately addresses the harm done to you, we would take that into consideration." I thought carefully about what I wanted from this situation. The Parkers had caused me significant stress, inconvenience, and financial harm. Greg's actions had been not just vindictive, but dangerous. Yet the prospect of him serving jail time over what had begun as a neighborly dispute gave me pause. After much deliberation, I decided to accept the settlement with one additional condition. The Parkers would need to move out of Oakridge Heights. Within 3 months, I didn't want to continue living near people who had demonstrated such hostility, and I suspected many other residents felt the same way. My counteroffer was met with initial resistance. Diana called me, alternating between anger and pleading. "You can't force us to move. We have a right to live here," she insisted. "Actually, I'm not forcing you to do anything," I replied calmly. "I'm offering a compromise regarding the criminal charges your husband is facing. You're free to reject it and proceed with the hearing." After consulting with their attorney, the Parkers reluctantly agreed to my terms. Greg would plead guilty to a reduced charge of criminal mischief, likely resulting in probation rather than jail time, and they would sell their townhouse and move within 3 months. The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was surprisingly full. Several of our neighbors had come to observe the proceedings, underscoring how public the dispute had become. Greg looked diminished in his suit, nervously adjusting his tie, as he waited with his attorney. When called, he stood and entered his guilty plea to the reduced charge. The judge reviewed the case details, noting the disturbing escalation of a neighborhood dispute and the reckless disregard for safety demonstrated by the tampering. "Mr. Parker, your actions could have caused serious injury or worse." The judge admonished, "The court accepts your plea and the agreed-upon sentencing recommendation, but I want to be very clear. You are receiving leniency today largely due to the victim's willingness to compromise. Should you violate the terms of your probation or engage in any similar behavior in the future, that leniency will not be extended again." Greg was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, ironically, with an environmental conservation organization, and ordered to comply with all terms of our settlement agreement, including the requirement to move. We exited the courtroom. Several neighbors approached to express their support. Rachel, whose testimony had been crucial, seemed relieved that the ordeal was concluding without a protracted trial. "The community charging stations are being installed next week," she mentioned. "The HOA fast-tracked the project after everything. That happened. I guess there's a silver lining to all this." Over the following weeks, I watched as a for sale sign appeared in front of the Parkers' townhouse. True to the settlement, they were preparing to move. Diana avoided me entirely now, and on the rare occasions I encountered Greg, he kept his eyes downcast, the smugness completely gone from his demeanor. My repaired charging station worked perfectly, now secured with additional protections and covered by multiple security cameras. The newly installed community charging stations were also up and running, providing other electric vehicle owners with a proper, sanctioned place to charge. 1 month after the hearing, the Parkers' townhouse sold. I watched from my window as they loaded the last of their belongings into a moving truck. There was no dramatic final confrontation, no last-minute threats or accusations, just the quiet end to a conflict that had consumed months of our lives and brought out the worst in everyone involved. With the Parkers gone, life at Oakridge Heights gradually returned to normal. The community charging stations proved to be a tremendous success, with a reservation system that ensured fair access for all EV owners. Ironically, had the Parkers simply waited a few months instead of feeling entitled to use my property, they would have had the legitimate charging solution they claimed to want. Though the immediate conflict was resolved, the experience had changed me. I found myself more cautious, more aware of the potential for everyday disputes to spiral out of control. I had installed additional security cameras around my townhouse that I had no immediate plans to remove, and I remained more guarded with neighbors than I had been before. 6 weeks after the Parkers' departure, the HOA organized a community gathering to officially introduce the new charging stations and discuss other green initiatives. The turnout was impressive, with nearly every resident in attendance. Vivian, the HOA president, took the opportunity to address the elephant in the room. Recent events have tested our community. she said carefully, "but they've also pushed us to accelerate improvements that benefit everyone. Today's gathering is about moving forward together." The atmosphere was positive as residents discussed solar panel installations, community composting, and other environmental projects. It felt like the community was reclaiming the genuine environmental activism that the Parkers had tried to weaponize for their personal benefit. After the meeting, several neighbors lingered to chat. Rachel approached me with a smile. "You know, something good actually came from all this chaos," she said. "We're getting to know each other better as a community." Before the charging station saga, as everyone's calling it, I barely knew any of my neighbors. She was right. The dispute had brought people together, creating connections that might not have formed otherwise. Residents were more engaged with community issues and more conscious of the balance between individual rights and community benefits. A week later, I received an unexpected letter. It had been forwarded from Oakridge Heights to my address, and the return address showed it came from the Parkers' new location, a city about 50 miles away. I hesitated before opening it, wondering what more they could possibly have to say. Inside was a handwritten letter from Greg. "Marcus, I've started the anger management and community service portions of my probation, and part of the process is making amends to those I've harmed. My therapist suggested I write this letter, but to be honest, I've been resistant to the idea. Pride is a difficult thing to overcome. The truth is I was wrong. Diana and I both were. We felt entitled to use your property because it aligned with our beliefs about resource sharing. But we never stopped to consider that true community requires respect and consent, not taking what isn't offered." What began as convenience quickly became something else, a battle of principles where I lost sight of basic decency. When you resisted, it became personal. I convinced myself that your boundaries were selfish, that my actions were justified by a greater environmental good. This distorted thinking led me to damage your property in a way that could have harmed someone. I'm not asking for forgiveness. What I did was criminal and dangerous, and the consequences I'm facing are deserved. I simply wanted you to know that I recognize the wrong I did to you and that I am working to ensure I never repeat such behavior. Diana and I are divorcing. The stress of the case and move exposed deeper problems in our relationship, particularly my anger issues and her enabling of them. This too is for the best. Our actions upended your life for months, and no apology can undo that harm. I only hope that with us gone, you can reclaim the peace we stole from you. Greg Parker. I read the letter several times, unsure how to feel. The apology seemed genuine, but it also wasn't my responsibility to absolve Greg of his guilt. I decided not to respond, not out of lingering anger, but because closing this chapter completely felt like the healthiest option for everyone. 2 months later, I attended another HOA meeting where they unveiled plans for an expanded green initiative. At Oakridge Heights, the community charging stations had been so successful that they were adding more, along with solar-powered lighting for common areas and a rainwater collection system for the community garden. As I looked around at my engaged neighbors discussing these improvements, I realized that the Parkers had been right about one thing. Community resources and environmental consciousness were important. Where they had gone wrong was in thinking they could bypass the most essential element of community, respect for one another. My charging station remained locked when I wasn't using it, not out of selfishness, but as a boundary that represented a simple truth: genuine sharing comes from choice, not coercion. As Oakridge Heights embraced more communal environmental solutions, this principle became the foundation of our success, where the Parkers' approach had failed. Almost a year had passed since the Parkers left Oakridge Heights. The community charging stations had been fully operational for months, with a smooth reservation system that gave everyone fair access. My own charging station remained exclusively mine, though occasionally I'd offer its use to neighbors during emergencies. The townhouse formerly owned by the Parkers had been purchased by a couple in their 30s, Ellie and James Chen, who quickly integrated into the community. They drove a hybrid rather than a fully electric vehicle and were pleasantly low-key compared to their predecessors. One evening as I returned from work, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked near the community stations, a sleek, new electric Rivian truck. A woman was studying the charging system with obvious confusion. "Need some help?" I offered, approaching her. She turned with a grateful smile. "Yes, please. I'm Vanessa Morales, just moved into Unit 26. I can't figure out how to activate these stations." I explained the reservation system and helped her set up an account on her phone. "It's pretty straightforward once you're registered. The HOA manages it to ensure everyone gets fair access." "That's fantastic," she said. "My last complex had a first-come, first-served policy that was a disaster. People would leave passive-aggressive notes on windshields and unplug each other's cars." I chuckled. "Trust me, I know exactly how that goes." We chatted as her truck charged, and I found myself enjoying her company. Vanessa was an environmental engineer who'd moved to the area for a new job, developing more efficient solar panel systems. Her knowledge of renewable energy was impressive, and her passion for sustainability was genuine, not a performative show like Diana's had been. Over the next few weeks, Vanessa and I ran into each other frequently at the charging stations. Our conversations grew longer, often continuing over coffee at the complex's small cafe. I found myself looking forward to these encounters more than I cared to admit. "You know," she said one evening as we walked back from the cafe, "I heard about what happened with your charger and those former residents. People still talk about it sometimes." "Not my finest hour," I admitted, "though in my defense they did start it." She laughed. "From what I heard, you handled it with remarkable restraint. Most people would have lost it much sooner." She paused. "It's actually made an impact around here. People are really conscious about respecting each other's property while still finding ways to share community resources." The HOA's quarterly newsletter that month featured an article about the success of the community charging program. They were planning to expand it further and were considering adding solar panels to the complex's clubhouse to offset some of the electricity costs. The article credited the challenging experiences of the past with spurring these positive changes. I was mentioned by name as having raised important questions about the balance between personal property rights and community resource sharing. It felt like a strange kind of vindication. My conflict with the Parkers had ultimately led to something positive for Oakridge Heights. One Saturday morning, I was at home when my doorbell rang. Opening it, I found Vanessa holding 2 coffee cups. "I thought you might like some caffeine," she said with a smile, "and I wanted to pick your brain about something." We sat on my small patio as she explained that the HOA was forming a sustainability committee to guide future green initiatives, and she'd been asked to lead it. "They want representatives from various parts of the complex," she said, "and your name came up repeatedly as someone who should be involved." I must have looked surprised because she quickly added, "You have a unique perspective. You understand both the importance of personal boundaries and the value of community resources. That's exactly the balance we need." The irony wasn't lost on me. After being vilified by the Parkers as anti-environment for protecting my property, I was now being recruited for my balanced approach to sustainability. "I'd be happy to participate," I told her, "as long as no one expects me to share my toothbrush in the name of resource conservation." She laughed. "I think we can safely say personal hygiene items are off the community sharing table." As spring arrived, the Sustainability Committee began implementing new projects. We installed rain barrels for garden irrigation, organized a community composting system, and started a monthly swap meet where residents could exchange items they no longer needed instead of discarding them. Through it all, Vanessa and I worked closely together. Our coffee meetings evolved into dinners, and soon we were dating. She understood intuitively what the Parkers never could: that true community isn't built by forcing people to share their resources, but by creating systems where everyone contributes willingly and benefits equally. One evening, as we walked through the complex after a committee meeting, we passed my charging station, now rarely used since I primarily charged at the community stations. "You know," Vanessa said thoughtfully, "your infamous charger started quite a journey. Without that conflict, none of these initiatives might have happened. And we might never have met," I added, taking her hand. She smiled. "Sometimes good things come from unexpected places. Even property disputes over electricity. The Sustainability Committee's success exceeded everyone's expectations. 6 months in, Oakridge Heights had reduced its overall energy consumption by 15% and water usage by nearly 20%. Our initiatives were featured in the local newspaper, and neighboring communities began reaching out for advice on implementing similar programs. Vanessa and I had grown closer through our work together. Her practical approach to environmentalism was refreshing, focused on realistic solutions rather than self-righteous posturing. What had begun as a professional collaboration had blossomed into something much more meaningful. One evening, as we were finalizing plans for a community-wide energy audit, Vanessa received an email that made her eyebrows rise. "You're not going to believe this," she said, turning her laptop toward me. "It's from the Regional Sustainable Communities Conference. They want us to present our program as a case study." I skimmed the email, impressed by the opportunity. The conference was significant, attended by community planners, environmental advocates, and local government representatives from across the state. "This is fantastic," I replied. "Our little charging station dispute has led to something genuinely impactful." "That's the thing," Vanessa said hesitantly. "Look at the list of other presenters." I scrolled down and froze when I saw a familiar name: Diana Parker. She was listed as a speaker representing Green Share Collaborative, presenting on community resource-sharing models. "Well, that's unexpected," I managed. Vanessa watched me carefully. "We don't have to accept if it would be uncomfortable. There will be other opportunities." I considered this for a moment. Part of me wanted to avoid any further interaction with the Parkers, yet another part was curious about what Diana was doing now and whether she had actually learned anything from our conflict. "No, we should go," I decided. "Our program deserves recognition, and I'm not going to let old conflicts get in the way of that." The conference was scheduled for the following month in a convention center downtown. As the date approached, I found myself increasingly anxious about potentially encountering Diana. Had she changed, or would she still harbor the same self-righteous attitudes that had driven our conflict? The day of the conference arrived. Vanessa and I prepared our presentation, which highlighted how Oakridge Heights had balanced individual property rights with community resource sharing. We emphasized that successful sustainability initiatives required consensus and respect, not coercion. Our session was scheduled for the afternoon. In the morning, we attended other presentations, including Diana's. I was surprised to see her appear on stage alone, without Greg. She looked different. Her previously highlighted hair was now its natural brown, and her designer clothes had been replaced by a simple professional outfit. "2 years ago," she began, "I was involved in a neighborhood dispute that taught me everything I was doing wrong as an environmental advocate." My jaw nearly dropped. "This was not the introduction I had expected," Diana continued. "My husband and I believed so strongly in our environmental principles that we felt justified in taking what wasn't ours to take. We convinced ourselves that our neighbor's unwillingness to share his electric vehicle charger made him the villain in our story. We were wrong. She went on to describe how the conflict had escalated, though she tactfully avoided mentioning names or the criminal charges that resulted. She spoke about her divorce and her subsequent re-evaluation of her approach to environmental advocacy. What I learned is that true sustainability can't be built on entitlement or coercion, she explained. Lasting change comes from respect, consent, and genuine community building. Green Share Collaborative was born from that realization. We help communities create voluntary resource-sharing programs that respect individual boundaries while maximizing collective benefits. Her presentation was thoughtful, humble, and surprisingly practical. The Diana speaking on stage seemed worlds apart from the entitled neighbor who had once claimed my electricity as community power. After her session ended, I debated whether to approach her. Before I could decide, she spotted me in the crowd. Her eyes widened in recognition, and after a moment's hesitation, she walked over. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I didn't expect to see you here. I'm presenting this afternoon," I explained, "about Oakridge Heights' sustainability initiatives." An awkward silence fell between us. Finally, Diana spoke. "I owe you an apology," she said. "A real one, not the half-hearted justifications we offered before. What Greg and I did was wrong, not just legally, but morally. We violated your boundaries repeatedly and then tried to vilify you for protecting your property." Her sincerity caught me off guard. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "Your presentation was actually quite good. It sounds like you found a more constructive approach," she nodded. "After everything fell apart, I had to reevaluate what I was really trying to accomplish. The environmental goals were legitimate, but my methods were all wrong." I introduced her to Vanessa, who had been watching our interaction with interest. To my surprise, they fell into an easy conversation about community resource-sharing models. Diana asked thoughtful questions about our program, genuinely interested in learning rather than judging. As our conversation with Diana continued, I found myself in the surreal position of actually enjoying her company. The self-righteous entitlement that had defined her during our neighborhood conflict had been replaced by genuine reflection and humility. "What happened to Greg?" I finally asked, curious about her ex-husband's fate. Diana's expression turned serious. "After his probation ended, he moved to Colorado. The anger management therapy helped him recognize some deeper issues. Last I heard, he was working with a wildlife conservation group, spending more time in nature and less time trying to control others." When it was time for our presentation, Diana surprised us by staying to watch. Vanessa and I detailed Oakridge Heights' transformation into a model of sustainable living, from our community charging stations to our solar initiatives and resource-sharing programs. We emphasized how respecting individual boundaries had actually strengthened community participation rather than hindering it. The key insight, Vanessa explained to the audience, was recognizing that sustainable communities aren't built through coercion or shame, but through systems that make sharing resources beneficial for everyone involved. After our presentation, several community planners approached us with questions. Diana waited patiently until the crowd thinned before offering her thoughts. "Your approach bridges the gap I've been trying to address in my work," she said. "You've created systems where individual choice and community benefit reinforce each other rather than competing." An idea began to form in my mind, one that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. "Have you considered collaborating with established communities to implement your models? Your experiences combined with our practical systems could be quite effective." Diana looked surprised by the suggestion. "Are you proposing what I think you're proposing?" "A limited collaboration between Greenshare and Oakridge Heights," I confirmed. "We could develop a case study together, documenting both the pitfalls to avoid and the systems that actually work. Vanessa nodded thoughtfully. It would make a powerful statement, showing how conflict can transform into constructive cooperation. Diana seemed genuinely moved by the offer. After everything that happened, you'd be willing to work with me? It's not about forgetting the past, I explained. It's about learning from it. Our conflict taught both of us important lessons about boundaries. In community, why not use that shared experience to help others avoid the same mistakes? We exchanged contact information and agreed to discuss the potential collaboration further after the conference. On the drive home, Vanessa gave me a sideways glance. "That was unexpected," she said. "Are you really comfortable working with Diana? After everything she put you through?" I considered the question carefully. The Diana I met today isn't the same person who tried to claim my electricity as community power. People can change. Sometimes they just need a reality check first. Like criminal charges and a divorce, Vanessa asked with a raised eyebrow. Extreme circumstances can lead to extreme growth, I replied. And if our collaboration helps other communities avoid similar conflicts, that's a net positive. The following week, Diana visited Oakridge Heights for a tour of our sustainability initiatives. Several residents recognized her, creating some initially awkward moments, but her genuine interest in our programs gradually won people over. In the community room, we outlined a potential 3-month collaboration. Diana would bring her theoretical framework and outreach experience, while we would provide our practical systems and implementation strategies. Together, we would create a comprehensive guide for communities transitioning to more sustainable practices. "I need to be transparent with everyone," Diana said, addressing the small group of committee members who had joined us. "Marcus and I have a complicated history. I made serious mistakes in how I approached shared resources when I lived here. Part of my motivation for this collaboration is to make amends for that behavior." Her honesty impressed me. This was a far cry from the woman who had once tried to shame me in front of our neighbors for protecting my property. As our planning session concluded, Rachel, the neighbor whose testimony had helped convict Greg, approached Diana cautiously. "You seem different," she observed. Diana nodded. "Losing everything gives you perspective. When your identity is built around being right at all costs, being proven dramatically wrong forces some serious self-reflection." "Well," Rachel said, after a moment, "I think this collaboration could be good for the community. Just keep the boundary crossing to the theoretical realm this time." Diana laughed, a genuine laugh without the condescension that had once characterized her interactions. "Absolutely. Boundaries are the first chapter in our guide." As we walked Diana to her car, a modest hybrid rather than the luxury Audi she'd once driven, she paused. "You know, I spent months being angry at you for destroying my life," she admitted. "It took a long time to realize you didn't destroy anything. You just held firm boundaries while I bulldozed over them. Everything that followed was the consequence of my actions, not yours." "That's surprisingly insightful," I replied. She smiled ruefully. "Therapy helps. So does losing your spouse, home, and self-image all at once. You either grow or break, and I decided to grow." Our collaboration with Diana and Green Share Collaborative progressed better than anyone could have anticipated. Over the next few months, we developed a comprehensive guide entitled "From Conflict to Cooperation: Building Sustainable Communities Through Respect and Shared Purpose." The guide incorporated both theoretical frameworks and practical implementation strategies, with our charging station dispute serving as a case study in what to avoid and how to recover from community conflicts. Diana proved to be a valuable partner. Her network of environmental organizations helped spread our model to other communities, and her hard-won insights about the psychology of resource sharing added depth to our approach. What had begun as a tentative collaboration evolved into a genuine partnership. 6 months after the conference, we were invited to present our work at a national sustainability summit. Our presentation, which frankly addressed the conflict that had sparked our eventual cooperation, resonated with community leaders who had faced similar challenges. Afterward, a representative from the Department of Energy approached us about incorporating our model into their community sustainability guidelines. Your framework could help prevent the conflicts we've seen arising as more communities transition to shared renewable infrastructure, he explained. The balance you've struck between individual rights and community benefits is exactly what we've been looking for. This unexpected recognition led to a series of consulting opportunities. Vanessa and I, along with Diana, found ourselves traveling to communities across the state to help implement sustainable resource-sharing programs. Each community had its unique challenges, but the core principles we had developed at Oakridge Heights proved remarkably adaptable. During one such consulting trip, Diana received a message that visibly rattled her. When she excused herself abruptly. From our planning session, I followed to check on her. "Everything okay?" I asked, finding her staring at her phone in the hotel lobby. "It's Greg," she said quietly. "He's in town and wants to meet. Says he has something important to discuss." I was surprised by this development. "Are you going to see him?" Diana hesitated. "I'm not sure. We haven't spoken in over a year. The divorce wasn't pleasant. Do you want company?" I offered, surprising myself. "Moral support?" She looked up, clearly touched by the suggestion. "You would do that, after everything he did?" "People change," I said simply. "You're proof of that." The next evening, we met Greg at a quiet cafe downtown. He looked different. The arrogant businessman had been replaced by someone more weathered, with a beard and casual clothes. His expression when he saw me accompanying Diana was one of shock, followed by visible discomfort. "Marcus," he said awkwardly. "I didn't expect—" "Diana didn't mention—" "I'm here as a friend," I explained. "Nothing more." Greg nodded slowly, processing this strange development. "I deserve that suspicion. After what I did to your property, I wouldn't blame you for never trusting me again." We settled at a table, the initial tension gradually easing as Diana explained our collaboration. Greg listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking thoughtful questions about implementation challenges. "The reason I wanted to meet," he finally said, "is that I've been working with a conservation group in Colorado that's developing small-scale renewable energy systems for remote communities. We've been struggling with some of the same issues. You're addressing how to balance individual needs with community resources. When I saw online that you were doing this work, Diana, I thought your expertise might help." "Our expertise," Diana corrected, gesturing to include me. "Marcus and I are partners in this project, along with his girlfriend, Vanessa." Greg took a deep breath. "Then I'd like to ask both of you for help. The communities we're working with have limited resources and complicated social dynamics. Your framework might be exactly what we need." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The man who had once claimed my electricity as community power was now asking for legitimate guidance on community resource sharing. But there was no entitlement in his request, just humble recognition of expertise he didn't possess. "Send us your project details," I suggested. "We'll see if our approach fits your needs." As we parted ways, Greg extended his hand to me. "I know a handshake doesn't erase the past, but I want you to know I'm truly sorry for what happened. The person I was then, I don't recognize him anymore." I accepted his handshake. Sometimes it takes losing your way to find a better path. Back at Oakridge Heights, our community continued to evolve. The Sustainability Committee had grown to include representatives from every building in the complex. Our initiatives had reduced utility costs significantly, creating a financial incentive that reinforced environmental consciousness. My personal charging station, the unlikely catalyst for all these developments, had become something of a community landmark. New residents were told its story as part of their orientation, not as neighborhood gossip, but as an important lesson in how communities navigate the complex intersection of individual rights and collective benefits. 2 years after the charging station dispute that had upended my life, I stood on a small stage at the National Sustainable Communities Conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address. The audience included environmental advocates, urban planners, community organizers, and government officials, all eager to learn from our experience. Beside me stood Vanessa, now my fiancée, and Diana, now a respected colleague. In the audience sat Greg, who had flown in from Colorado to support our presentation. The journey from bitter enemies to reluctant allies to genuine collaborators had been unexpected but profoundly transformative for all of us. "Good morning," I began. "Our story starts with an electric car charger and a claim of community power. It could have ended with criminal charges and lasting enmity. Instead, it evolved into something none of us could have imagined, a framework for building truly sustainable communities based on respect, consent, and mutual benefit." As I recounted our story, from the initial conflict to our current nationwide initiative, I reflected on how this seemingly trivial dispute had changed not just our lives, but the lives of thousands of people in communities across the country. Our guide had been adopted by over 50 communities, helping them navigate the complex social dynamics of shared resources. The Department of Energy had incorporated our principles into their community sustainability recommendations. Most surprisingly, our conflict-to-cooperation model was being taught in environmental policy courses at several universities. After the presentation, a journalist approached us for an interview. "Your story is compelling," she said, "but what I find most interesting is that you've all worked together despite your history. How did you move past such a serious conflict?" Diana answered first. "We recognized that our goals were actually aligned, even if our methods weren't. We all wanted more sustainable communities. We just disagreed on how to get there. I had to learn that true environmentalism isn't about imposing your will on others," Greg added. "It's about creating systems where doing the right thing is also the most beneficial thing for everyone involved. And I learned that protecting individual boundaries doesn't have to conflict with community goals," I concluded. "In fact, respect for boundaries creates the trust necessary for voluntary cooperation." That evening, the four of us had dinner together to celebrate the successful presentation. As we shared stories about our work in different communities, I marveled at how far we had come from those tense confrontations in the Oakridge Heights parking lot. "You know," Vanessa observed, "if Diana and Greg had just asked permission to use your charger in the first place, none of this would have happened." "True," Diana acknowledged with a wry smile. "But then we wouldn't have developed our framework, and dozens of communities would still be struggling with the same conflicts." "Sometimes the worst experiences lead to the best outcomes," Greg reflected. "Though I wouldn't recommend criminal charges as a personal growth strategy." We all laughed. The tension of our shared history now transformed into something like wisdom. Back at Oakridge Heights, our sustainable community model continued to flourish. The original charging stations had been supplemented with a small solar array that offset much of their electricity consumption. Our resource-sharing systems had expanded to include tool libraries, community gardens, and even a car-sharing program for residents who only needed occasional access to vehicles. My personal charging station, the unlikely catalyst for all these developments, remained in place, though I rarely used it now. The community stations were more convenient, and there was something satisfying about using a resource we had all helped create. One afternoon, I encountered a new resident struggling to understand the community charging system. As I helped her set up her account, she asked about the origins of our sustainability initiatives. "It's a long story," I said with a smile, "but it starts with a charging station, a Tesla, and a couple who believed in community power." "Did it work out?" she asked. "Not the way anyone expected," I replied, "but yes, ultimately it worked out better than we could have imagined." As I walked away, I reflected on how a dispute that had once consumed my life with anger and frustration had ultimately led to purpose, connection, and positive change far beyond our small community. The Parkers had been wrong about many things, but they had been right about one crucial insight. Resources are most valuable when they benefit everyone. The irony wasn't lost on me. Their entitled attempt to claim my community power had failed spectacularly, but through that failure, we had all discovered what real community power actually meant. Not the right to take what belongs to others, but the choice to create something beneficial together, respecting boundaries while working toward common goals. In the end, that was the lesson worth sharing, one electric car charger at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.